What's up everyone, Thralls Metal here once again. I'm the Crockneck, and I'm back with some more underrated albums. And if you're looking at the title of this one, yeah, I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna go over some underrated nu metal. I kind of toyed with this idea a while ago and decided why not give it a shot, because at one point I was really into nu metal. Pretty much from the late 90s all the way through the early 2000s. I really dug that stuff. And while I do not advocate it ever coming back in any form, and it seems like it probably will because nostalgia has a way of bringing back some stuff that maybe should have just been, buried in the past, I think it should stay there. But at the same time, there were some things that I really enjoyed, and I mean, I still have a thing for the early Korn albums. I don't mind Slipknot. Mudvayne's first album I think is really great, and there's a lot of underrated ones out there, a lot of bands that, well, namely I saw at Ozfest in those early years from like 97 to 2003 I think, that popped up on there and I really got into. And Ozfest is going to be definitely a theme on here pretty much throughout the video, because a lot of these bands I did see on there. And this was an interesting period of time just in terms of metal in general. This was probably one of the last times that I think major labels were constantly hunting down new metal bands like NU and NEW. They wanted to capitalize on this thing that, Korn got big on, and, Coal Chamber did well. So it was kind of interesting just to see, like, Atlantic Records, Epic Records, Warner Brothers actually going after all these bands and having this giant scene that kind of popped up for, thankfully, a short amount of time. Now, most of the time, metal is kind of relegated to a handful of larger, more metal labels and a lot of small ones all over the place. This was a very different period. But again, like any subgenre, there were things that I did like, and I am going to go into those, and they all kind of fall in different periods. And some of the stuff is maybe proto nu metal, like before there was really a term for it. So yeah, this is going to be kind of an interesting bunch of albums here, but let's just get into it, and hopefully I can restore my credibility maybe a little bit after this. The Apex Theory, Topsy, Turvy. This is the lone full length from this LA band that were closely tied to System of a Down. In fact, at one point I think they shared a member. I think it might have been the drummer, but he left before this came out. Now, I had heard about these guys courtesy of their first EP, and I really enjoyed their sound. This was very similar to System of a Down, especially in the fact that all the members were also Armenian, and they did inject that culture into the music. But these guys were a little bit different in terms of how jazzy they were, and I would say vocally they were maybe more accessible than System of a Down, because Serge has a very strange, wild voice that some people just could not get into. The frontman on here, I believe his name was Andy, I can't pronounce his last name, it's very Armenian, had more of a straightforward sort of rock voice, but he did do some interesting vocal flourishes on here. The music on here is very well written. It kind of stays away from like the nu metal tropes. There's no rapped vocals really. There's a bit on that on Hope Diggy, which is a really interesting song, but it's more of like a jazzy beat poet rant. But they stayed away from like the repetitive Korn riffs, the da-dun, da-dun, you'd hear on every nu metal release, and loads of melody and lots of layers to the music. I really enjoyed this release still, actually. And I actually saw this band at Ozfest and here in Toledo. And this was a very short-lived band. They, in fact, kind of started to split up not too long after Ozfest. When I had actually saw them here in Toledo, I believe it was with Chevelle and The Used. They were the opening act, and the frontman seemed pretty unapproachable. And not too long after that show, he exited the band, and then the band changed their name to Mount Helium, which honestly I've not heard any of their stuff. But if they still retain their really wild drummer and a really cool guitarist in terms of like the cool melodies that the guy brought in, I'm actually eager to check that out. But yeah, this is a killer release. There are tons of just unbelievably catchy tracks on here, and this one I can revisit with little to no guilt at all in terms of nu metal. So yeah, this was an underrated gem, never really took off, but I strongly recommend at least checking these guys out. You might actually find something you really like on here. Dry Kill Logic, The Darker Side of Nonsense. This is their debut album, came out on Roadrunner Records in 2001, and This band kind of got off to like a rough start in terms of their original name. Their original name was Hinge AD, and I guess there was a suit in terms of who had rights to the name because there was another band named that. And I remember the original promos coming out with it saying Hinge AD on here. So when I saw this same strange, ugly cover with a different name on it, I had to like double check and make sure it was the same band, and it was. Now, honestly, this is their only nu metal release. This was their debut. They're kind of coming in on the tail end of nu metal because nu metal really started dying out around 2003, I would say. And this is almost more akin to like the earlier 90s like groove metal thing, like the mid 90s thing where, you know, bands were sort of aping Pantera because they were super successful. This has a lot of that, but it also has, of course, a lot of the nu metal tropes. They didn't have a DJ. Thankfully, none of these bands had an actual DJ in this list, but there were some scratches on here that they sort of sampled in. I really like the vocalist. He has this raw, throaty sound. Really good growls. The cleans are kind of pockmarked in there. This is predominantly very aggressive. The song A Better Man Than Me and Rot are particularly heavy, like, you know, kind of more groove metal Pantera heavy than, say, Korn and Limp Bizkit and all that horse shit. I like the fact that most of this was not meant for the radio, and that was kind of a thing with nu metal, was getting on the radio because there was this level of accessibility. Korn was on the radio, Limp Bizkit was on the radio, etc. A lot of these bands kind of shot for the radio, and whether or not they were super heavy, they almost always had a radio single. This band really didn't. In fact, their lead-off single, the opening track, Nightmare, was almost all growls. And it also featured, you know, a repeated line with the word shit in it. So they weren't trying that hard for the radio, honestly. I like the little nods to hardcore that are on here too, but mostly the song Rot is the one I always come back to just because it sort of lampoons the Spice Girls, Do You Want to Be My Lover, or whatever the fuck that song was. They kind of do the opening section where they're kind of making fun of that and kind of taking their own spin on it, and it's a thoroughly enjoyable song. Really fun album. Their remaining releases, they have 2 other albums, and I believe they're still active, though they just haven't put out anything in a while, are definitely more groove metal / metalcore. But this is a fun release. I think this is one of those bands that towards the end of nu metal's run, it started getting a bit heavier and started pushing more towards what I would say is actual metal and not like closer to radio rock. So I do appreciate it for that. But I do come back to this one every now and then, and I still have a lot of fun listening to it. And if you've never heard it, I recommend checking it out. You know, it's a little dated. All these are a little dated, but it's a lot of fun, and Rot is pretty much the one that you should just jam on here because it's ridiculous. So check it out. Orange 9mm, driver not included. This is this band's debut album, came out in 1995 on East West Records, and this is almost more proto nu metal. There are a lot of elements that would carry over to nu metal. There are rapped vocals, loads of groove, more like down-tuned chunky guitars, but this also had elements of post-hardcore and alternative, and actually just straight up hardcore. This was a lot of fun to listen to. Again, I still love this album. The fact that it has a bit of an earlier sound, but all the other stuff kind of carries over, it's kind of on the cusp as to whether or not it's nu metal. Their later stuff definitely pushed more of the rapped vocals. This, they're more shouted, but still kind of rapped, but I love the energy on this album. This album is just non-stop tracks of high energy, just aggression, and I love it. It's kind of like Rage Against the Machine, except mix that with Helmet and like maybe Sick of It All, because there is pure hardcore energy all over it. The songs Magnet and Pissed especially, I still jam this album quite frequently just because it's sort of like this interesting little window of time. Like you were kind of hearing what would become tropes of kind of a maligned subgenre of metal, but this still kind of sits outside of it. So, you know, don't lump them in with, you know, Limp Bizkit and all that bullshit. This is really good stuff, and if you're a hardcore fan especially, I think you could really get into this. I like all their releases, to be honest. They are a little bit more nu metal-y towards the end, but the fact that they always had killer riffs. Their frontman, Chaka Malik, I think that's his name, who I believe has some other projects now. Hell of a vocalist, hell of a frontman, always energetic. I really, really just enjoyed that because it just kind of connected with his energy. This is a fun release. If it helps, don't think of it as nu metal, just think of it as proto nu metal or hardcore, whatever, but it kind of sat right there in that mix, so I included it on here. But definitely check this out. This is an underrated gem in my opinion. Ultraspank Progress. This is the second album from this LA band that had an exceptionally stupid name, but actually wrote some cool music. Now the name, I guess, is tied to Rob Zombie. They were at one point called Spank, and I guess they were being sued by another band called Spank, which I don't know why any band wanted to be called Spank, but whatever. So Rob Zombie apparently suggested them just make it Ultraspank, and they rolled with it, and then they got signed to Epic Records. Now, the first album I thought was okay. I heard about them courtesy of them being on Ozfest, and pretty much I was at this point where if they were on Ozfest, whether they were second stage or main stage, and I hadn't heard of them, I kind of felt obligated to buy their music because more than likely I was going to go to Ozfest that year. And I bought their first album and it was okay. Now, I got their second album just because, like, well, I might as well see if there is some actual progress here. And I really still enjoy this album. This really brought forward better production, bigger riffs, bigger hooks. Their frontman, Pete Murray, has quite an exceptional vocal range. Like, he screams, he growls, there's lots of really good clean singing. He's got just these long bellowed notes that he does, kind of similar to, I don't know, I guess Maynard, a little bit. His intonation is kind of close to Maynard too. These guys blended a lot of different elements. Like, while it was nu metal, there were definitely elements of industrial and alternative in here, and they really knew how to write some big hooks. Like the song Smile, which all of these songs have one-word titles, which was kind of a nu metal thing, honestly. Everyone just want to minimize everything. But that song has an incredible chorus. I really love it. That and the song Click, honestly, they should have been radio singles. They should have been on the radio and they probably would have taken off. But I don't think this label promoted them very well, like at all. Major labels, of course, are frequently changing personnel and such, and you could get signed and brought in by one group of people and they could be fired, and then the next group of people do not give a shit about your band and looking to just sort of usher you out the door and get you far away. And that's pretty much what happened. After this album did not get the proper support, they pretty much broke up because they were sort of disenchanted with pretty much the whole music industry, which is sad because this album has a lot of killer songs. There's a lot of heavy songs in here that I think are still kind of accessible now, just in terms of like not sounding fiercely dated. The song Thanks especially is particularly heavy. There's really cool syncopated rhythms on here. To me, a lot of this is like a better version of Breaking Benjamin. You know, this was definitely more experimental. Not every song was kind of following that same syncopated chug. They actually had dynamics on here. So this was legit progress. But unfortunately, I don't think many people heard it. So that's kind of sad. But if you want to give this one a chance, I strongly recommend it. This is a killer album loaded with great melodic hooks, and it does actually bring the heavy, which I think is really good because a lot of this kind of flirted with accessibility. This one did, but it still crafted a good balance. So yeah, definitely check this out. It is an underrated album for sure. DowntheSun, self-titled. This is the lone full length from this nu metal band that actually brought in elements of extreme metal. They were from KC and Des Moines. They had members in both, and they pretty much got their start because they opened up for Slipknot on a few dates, and Slipknot really enjoyed them, so they brought them in and got them signed to Roadrunner Records. These guys came towards the end of nu metal, so again, this was that period where nu metal got heavier. Slipknot was definitely heavier than a lot of the stuff that came out before, like Korn and Limp Bizkit and Coal Chamber. So was Mudvayne. Mudvayne was definitely more heavy and more technical. This kind of matched up with that, even going as far as bringing in blast beats and death metal elements on here. This album is vicious for a nu metal album. Again, not flirting with accessibility at all. There are very few tracks that actually have big melodic hooks. These were all about angry, twisted, ugly songs with really, really strange soundscapes. Their keyboardist, which I believe his name was Church, did really like nasty industrial samples, and then like samples from twisted films about like heroin addicts and shit. It was kind of an unsettling listen at the time. Going back and listening to this, I think this honestly has a lot more in common with like deathcore. Like this could almost be like a proto deathcore sound. I don't know. It didn't really scream nu metal. You didn't get the rap vocals, but this is where, you know, it was pretty much lumped in, and This band broke up not too long after this release. It was a little too strange for some people to digest, especially the last 2 tracks, Jars and Revelations. Revelations is 15 minutes of pure noisy nonsense. And I guess I kind of appreciate it as like an artistic statement, but I don't know, it's just kind of weird. And then Jars is also strange. It starts off very accessible, you start hearing more clean vocals, and then it just descends into madness. This is an interesting listen, and like I said, you can actually hear the new metal sound starting to evolve and becoming more heavy again. So, you know, those old school tropes of, you know, death metal and thrash metal started kind of bubbling to the surface, and change was in the air. But unfortunately, the only thing that changed for this band was that they didn't exist. But yeah, short-lived band, pretty solid album though. I recommend checking it out, especially if you like just weird, crazy sounding music, especially those last few tracks. But yeah, good stuff. Definitely check it out. Kilgore, A Search for Reason. This is this band's second album, technically, though they were known as Kilgore Smudge. Initially, they just dropped the smudge. This came out on Revelation Records, and this band played at Ozfest 98. Again, that theme of Ozfest is definitely going to carry through most of this. These guys had almost like sort of a retro groove metal sound, though they were lumped in the new metal pack just because that's kind of, I guess, where they fit. Now, these guys were from Providence, Rhode Island, and one of my favorite things about this band, not only the fact that they are just riff driven, it's almost, again, more of that mid-90s groove metal sound. I really like the lyrics on here. The lyrics are very thoughtful. Like, they're actually very smart. I believe the frontman was big into like beat poetry and like Franz Kafka and such, and those tropes sort of echo in a lot of his own lyrics. And I kind of appreciated that just as something different, because a lot of new metal, let's be honest, kind of felt a little dumbed down. That and the fact that this is, again, riff driven. It's not all just corn riffs and such. It is actually like big hooks like you'd hear in Pantera, Life of Agony, stuff like that. I really enjoy this album still. Like, the production's really good. The vocals, all right. He does Jarl. It is a Jarl album, and he's got this deep Jarl, but I kind of want to forgive him. He kind of balances out between that and a pretty decent growl, but the Jarl is ever present, and it's a really, really distinct Jarl. But it's honestly pretty good. I don't mind listening to him, mostly because the lyrics are thoughtful and the melodies are really great, and this has a load of hooks. Now, they did have a really cool guest star on here on the song TK421. They actually had Burton Bell on here. And that one is a really interesting song in the sense that it's mostly a spoken word and him just ranting about, I don't know, something he doesn't like. Something he doesn't like, something about shallow people and vapid celebrities. I don't know. But it's a really cool song, and Burton does contribute some really nasty growls in here. This is a really good album, still. I think this is aged actually quite well. Not as much of a fan of the vocals as I was, because there was a point where I loved the Jarl stuff, but not so much now. But I believe this band is actually reforming. They broke up not so long after this. The frontman left, and he actually went on to do a country project, which I guess you can see where his voice would lend to that. But I guess they did reform and put out an EP, so these guys are technically still around. But this is the one I would say definitely check out. It's a fun album, it's riff-driven again, and the songs are catchy, and it's heavy, but not like nu metal heavy all the time. This actually has, again, that more groove metal sound. So if that sounds good, definitely check this out. 1 Minute Silence, Buy Now, Save Later. This is the second album from this Irish band. I actually saw these guys here in Toledo when they opened up for Mudvayne. God, I think it was probably 2000 when this album came out. And this was more straightforward rap metal. This being their second release, they actually sort of changed up their sound and became a little bit more metal. Their first album, I think, is okay. It had production issues, namely because I think they went with a hip-hop producer to do a metal album, which, not saying they can't, it's just they got a metal producer to do this one. This is Colin Richardson, and this is a definite evolution of the band. While there are still rap elements on here in terms of like rap vocals, there's more singing, there's more vocal dynamics, and there's a lot more like variety to the songs. Very groove laden, big chunky metallic guitars. They didn't sound like those big down-tuned sludgy guitars you'd hear on Korn albums. They actually had like a crisp metal chunkiness to them. And from the first album, there's definitely some more songwriting maturity in here. The song Holy Man, which I believe was a single, actually is really good, like almost more akin to, I would say, System of a Down. And these guys actually had some really cool lyrical themes too. They were more like socio-political, so a little bit of that Rage Against the Machine sort of energy carried over. But there was more of a high energy metal feel to it. I still enjoy this album. It's a really interesting listen, and again, I like that clear evolution. Now these guys, I believe, would put out another album after this and then break up, or they broke up and came back and put out that album. I'm really not sure, but I believe they're around now, and I don't think their style has changed much. I'm not really sure. I haven't gone and looked it up, but these guys had a little bit of success, and they seemed really cool. Like, I actually met them, and they were really nice guys, and part of me kind of wants to root for them, even though I don't want nu metal to come back. But yeah, while this hasn't aged as well, namely because like the rap vocals kind of seem a little bit more cringy now, because I just don't listen to rap rock or rap metal or nu metal really that much anymore. This was more of a deep dive to go back into this stuff. There's still a lot of stuff on here that I like. So if you're looking for some more obscure nu metal for a band that, you know, might have had a chance of breaking it big but just didn't, definitely check this out. Gizmachi The Imbuing. This is the second album from this New York band. Came out in 2005, and this band was signed by Sean Crahan. This was a band that he was a big fan of and signed to his label Big Orange Clown Records, and then it was distributed through the now defunct Sanctuary Records. I believe it's still defunct. But this was one of the last, I guess, nu metal bands that I heard of that I guess you could consider nu metal, though listening to it now, it's more like technical metalcore, almost gent. I think it kind of gents a little bit. Really interesting vocal dynamics. You have two guitarists that do clean vocals, and they kind of sound like Alice in Chains now, like kind of like William DuVall. And then you have a frontman who growls his guts out. Now, looking at them, they kind of scream nu metal band. They kind of wore like the zip up windbreakers, and you know, they look like a nu metal band. But musically, they were a lot different. Technicality isn't like a big thing in nu metal. It was kind of a minimalist thing, unless you had bands like Mudvayne and, you know, to a degree Slipknot. You weren't getting a lot of technical play. These guys brought a lot of technical play. This is polyrhythmic. There are lots of breakdowns on here that are particularly good. And for the most part, there aren't really any like rapped vocals. So the tropes for nu metal are kind of minimal on this, but the nu metal elements are still there, especially on songs like Burn, which I imagine maybe that was the one that they pitched to the labels, like, yeah, that's nu metal. And then they didn't hear the rest of it. It was like, oh, that's actually different. I don't know. They're just kind of a strange metal band, I guess, like kind of vaguely, because there are a lot of different elements in play on this, and the songwriting is pretty damn solid. So this was almost kind of like one of the last like nu metal releases that I went after because I thought it was nu metal, and then I appreciated it for being something different later. Now this band is actually putting out something new, I believe this year. They actually just resurfaced. So I'm kind of curious to hear where they evolve from here, because this was, again, nu metal because they kind of lumped it there, but there's a lot more going on here because this is just a different release. And honestly, I kind of appreciate it more now than I did when I initially got it, because it was like, I don't know, I don't get all these polyrhythmic breakdowns and shit. But this was still kind of a point where I was just getting into like Meshuggah and stuff, so that sort of stuff was not quite gelling yet. But it's aged really well, and I'm actually curious for that new release. So yeah, this is kind of an odd nu metal release, but I think it's still nu metal. I guess it's still nu metal. I'm gonna call it nu metal for the sake of this one, and it is definitely underrated, and I recommend you check it out. Human Waste Project, E-Lux. This came out in 1997 on Hollywood Records, and this is the lone studio album from this band. This actually features Mike Tempesta, who went on to join Powerman 5000 and is the little brother of John Tempesta, the longtime drummer for Rob Zombie, Drum and Helmet, tons of different bands, Testament. But this was an interesting, short-lived nu metal, mostly because that's where they kind of fit in terms of like getting them on bills, but there's also elements of groove metal, alternative, kind of like a post-grunge sound. The main star of the show on here is their awesomely twisted vocalist, Amy Echo. she had this almost doppelganger Gwen Stefani thing going. She was the Gwen Stefani vocalist that growled her guts out and screamed and shrieked, but she also could really sing and had this weird breathy voice that, I don't know, it was just absolutely captivating. She steals the show on here. Her range on here in terms of emotions and delivery is really, really good. And Mike D'Impesto's guitar work on here is really solid. It's more straightforward rock, but there are definitely some flat-out metal moments. I particularly like Slide and Disease, the opening track after the weird intro. This is an odd album because it kind of fits in a lot of different subgenres, and I don't know if the label really knew how to market them, because you look at their image, they screamed nu metal, but you listen to them, there's a lot more going on than just nu metal. It really had its own sound. It kind of reminded me a lot of Helmet, but with a really twisted female vocalist who excelled at her job. But there are so many songs in here that I really enjoy. Particularly Drown, I think, is a really good song. The song Dog is particularly catchy. It kind of reminds me a lot of like a Smashing Pumpkins song, except without Billy Corrigan's voice. Thankfully, I'm not a big Billy Corrigan fan. And Shine is particularly, you know, like dark and twisted. The lyrics on here are pretty dark and twisted too. Now I know Jammin' John probably brought this one up, I believe, in albums that got him into metal like in his teens, because we both kind of latched on this one, but I had other stuff that I got into that had a bigger impact. But I still love this album. It is still a really interesting listen, and again, it's one you could probably put on for fans of more like 90s alternative and kind of maybe ease them into the more metal stuff, because, you know, it's a little bit more accessible, and production-wise, it doesn't necessarily sound like a flat-out nu metal album, but it's just a strange album that, I don't know, maybe just didn't seem to fit in anywhere, so they lumped it under nu metal, and I don't know, that may have hindered their career because they broke up not too long after this album was released, I think like a year later. But this is a cool album. Strongly recommend checking it out. It's weird and it's fun, and it's aggressively 90s. So yeah, definitely check it out. And finally we have Pulse Ultra, Headspace. This is their lone studio album, came out in 2002 on Atlantic/Velvet Hammer, which I believe was the promotion company through Taproot, which Taproot was the band that got these guys signed, essentially. They're from Montreal, Quebec, or they were from, because they broke up not too long after this album. Bit of a theme here. This was a band I saw that was on Ozfest 2002, and I wanted to check them out, and I really enjoyed the music on here. The music, I think, is absolutely fantastic. It's more technical nu metal, that, you know, later nu metal that was a bit heavier. There's almost sort of a progressive flair, and even like bits of like jazz fusion on here. The first two songs especially, I really enjoy, like the polyrhythmic drums on here, Acceptance and Finding My Place, both labeled as Phase 1 and Phase 2. Really strong melodies, great bass work too. I really latched onto that. The main issue I had with this was the singer. He has this very strange voice. It's kind of similar to Stephen Richards from Taproot. It feels as though like he's singing while choking on a hot dog or something. I don't know what's going on there, but it's weird. It's almost kind of cartoonish. It isn't as though he can't sing. He can sing in key. When they harmonize with him, it sounds really good, but there's something about his voice that is always kind of put me off. But there's great songs in here. Slip and Sin is very Toolish. It has this really cool like tribal drum bridge with very Adam Jones style guitars. Big Brother actually has like a really cool breakdown towards the end, and these guys had like great melodies and great hooks, and I mean, again, even vocally, just it's the delivery. It's just kind of a strange listen. But I saw these guys at Ozfest 2002. It did not fare well for them. In fact, I think the crowd was pretty damn brutal with them, and I don't know if they actually finished the set. I would have liked to have seen them finish the set because I thought they were doing a good job, but the crowd was not having it. But this band broke up not too long after this was released. I believe the singer quit, and then the rest of the band essentially just kind of went their own ways, which, again, kind of a theme. This whole era towards the end of nu metal, there weren't enough new acts, I think, that really were, you know, getting the level of popularity as the ones that helped establish the genre. So that might have been part of the reason why nu metal's days were sort of waning around 2002. But I still think this is a really good release. It's very similar to Apex Theory in terms of the style. It's very just kind of wild and all over the place. But I strongly recommend checking it out. This is actually a really solid album. vocals, you know, acquired taste, but, you know, overall the melodies, the hooks, the riffs, the musicality, I really dig it. So yeah, definitely check this out. All right, that does it for talking about nu metal for a little bit. I don't know, I might do a second part to this if I can actually stomach listening to some of the stuff, because I listened to more than just those albums. There were quite a few that I went back to and listened to again, and I was like, oh my god, this sucks. What the hell was wrong with me? Why did I buy this? But those were ones that I still felt strongly about, and again, this is not me saying nu metal should come back at all. It should stay buried in the past. But I am going to say that there were some good albums done by some bands that were definitely nu metal, and that is still sort of like one of the nadirs of metal, I would say, just because you bring it up and you just watch people go, ugh, myself included. But this was actually kind of fun to go over, just because this is stuff that I have kind of ignored for years. Like, honestly, I had not listened to a lot of these in years, and luckily there was still a little bit of that magic that kind of got me into the genre initially. So again, I might actually return to this one. I might do a different genre next, I don't know. But it kind of depends on how this one goes, and we'll see how much of my credibility, what little I think I had, is destroyed after this. I don't know. This was actually fun though. I feel like I kind of needed to do it just because we don't really cover very much nu metal on this channel, and I don't own enough power metal to really cover power metal on here. But this was still fun. It kind of brought me back to when I was a idiot late teenager slash idiot early 20-year-old. I mean, the main theme there though is idiot, and arguably an idiot with questionable taste. But I definitely want to do some more underrated stuff, and of course working on Cannibal Corpse and more collection updates, so of course plenty coming. So if you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up, and if you are new to the channel, subscribe, because we do stuff like this all the time. We are also on Patreon, so if you'd like to help us out there will be a link below in the description. And we also have t-shirts for sale. Now we are pretty much down to 2X, XL, and large right now, but we are going to eventually order more shirts and more stuff that we're going to just brand our name on, so we'll keep you posted for that. So with that, I thank you very much for watching, and we will catch you later.